Zelle. Thank you to my co-chairman of the subcommittee, the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation. We work together on a bipartisan basis. Very pleased to welcome you to this hearing of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation, entitled Hearing on Fraud Alert, Shedding Light on Zelle. And I will give an opening statement to be followed by my ranking member. The banks of America have a dirty little secret. It's called Zelle, and it's not just Zelle, it's other P2P pay platforms, apps that people use to transfer money among their bank accounts. In the case of Zelle, it's nearly instantaneous. It's almost always irreversible, and it is owned by banks. In fact, Zelle is the largest peer-to-peer payment app. It's actually operated by Early Warning Services, which in turn is owned and operated by the 7 largest banks. And Zelle is often integrated into consumers' existing online bank accounts and mobile apps. Zelle markets itself as, quote, a fast and easy way to send and receive money, unquote. But as this committee has found, a fast and easy way to lose money is often what happens on Zelle. And that is probably a more accurate catchphrase for Zelle and for other P2P platforms as well. What distinguishes Zelle is speed, permanence, and bank ownership. And that's really the reason why we are focusing on Zelle, but the other platforms deserve attention as well. In fact, it's less well known than other payment apps like Cash App and Venmo, but Zelle is by far the largest, several times its nearest competitor. And it is approximately 3 times largest than its nearest rival. Zelle transfers are nearly instant and irreversible, and by the time a consumer knows they've been scammed, usually it's too late to do anything about it, at least according to Zelle and according to the banks that own, control, and in effect operate Zelle. Just 3 banks, JP Morgan, Chase, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo, handled 73% of all Zelle transactions in 2023. All peer-to-peer payment apps are susceptible to fraud, no question about that fact. And I want to be clear that fraud happens on all of them, but Zelle deserves particular attention because of its direct connection to trusted financial institutions. Zelle and the banks that own it offer to customers the appearance of the trust they feel they deserve. But the risks there are real and present, and they simply are failing to protect consumers in the way that they deserve. 13% of P2P platform users report sending money to someone and later realizing it was a scam. And the kinds of scams are various: me-to-me, employment, romance, AI. They have various categories, but the bottom line here is literally that the banks are failing to do what they should to protect their consumers. This subcommittee has heard many accounts of scams and fraud on Zelle. In California, a teenager received escalating death threats and lost $10,000 on Zelle simply for their initiative in coming forward. Ariana Duval, a college student in North Carolina, will tell us her story in receiving an exciting summer research opportunity from a professor mother was scammed out of $3,500 after being told that her brother had been arrested and needed bail money, and how she struggled to get their bank to recognize how its insufficient safety measures allowed the scam to play out. Again, we thank you both. Many types of scams exist, but what they have in common is that these stories and many other consumers entail lost money due to fraud, scams. Time and again, Zelle and the big banks have said they couldn't help. What they mean is they wouldn't help. And their attitude has been, not our problem. Well, to the banks of America, particularly the 7 that own and operate Zelle, it is your problem. You own it, just as you own Zelle. And you have the expertise, the resources, and the obligation to make sure that you do better. We are also going to hear from experts as part of this bipartisan inquiry into Zelle and Early Warning Services, the company that operates Zelle. And we hope to hear from the banks. We've actually invited them to come here in June and explain how they can do better and why they have failed to do so. We have found that customers of JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo submitted claims reflecting a combined total of $456 million lost to scams and fraud on Zelle in 1 year, 2022 alone. And only a fraction were repaid, $341 million. More than 2/3 of these losses were never repaid by those banks. The growth of mobile payments shows no signs of stopping, but unfortunately neither do the scammers who are preying on American consumers on those apps. Criminals are increasingly using scams tailored to individuals with AI voice cloning and personal details pulled from hacked data, sold on the dark web, and increasing the risks. Those risks are growing, so must the safeguards. Zelle and its owner banks are aware of these frightening trends, no question. They've been put on notice. They track detailed information about the latest scams, but they're failing to stop them and failing also to make their customers whole. There are concrete steps these institutions can take to better protect customers. For example, banks could extend the protections available to credit card users to Zelle transactions. They could allow customers to cancel or reverse a payment within a certain period of time. And they could, in effect, provide for better means of authentication, more friction, and more time before a transaction is completed. Those ideas are only a few of the possibilities. Unfortunately for consumers, it seems like the big banks have accepted that some of the transaction on Zelle will be fraudulent. They've made the decision that this is just the cost of doing business, but it's the cost to their consumers, not them, because it's the customer who is out of pocket. That's why we have invited Zelle and the 3 largest banks to appear. And today, in addition to Ms. Duvall and Ms. Humphreys, we will be hearing from experts who've studied this issue and can better suggest potential remedies and preventions. And I look forward to hearing from all of you, and now turn to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just ask that my written opening statement be entered in the record. I just have a couple comments. Interesting hearing. Obviously, consumer fraud, consumer scams are a real problem in our economy. Things like cybersecurity risks. I mean, all these things are troubling. It is noteworthy, though, to understand the differences between, for example, credit cards, debit cards, and these peer-to-peer. debit and credit cards, they're interchange fees, and so the banks literally rake in hundreds of billions of dollars worth of profit, which is why when there are unauthorized transactions, they quickly reimburse, not to 100%. I'm looking at Bank of America here, credit card about $2.2 billion worth of a fraud, they reimburse about 1.6. On debit cards, about $1 billion of a fraud, they reimbursed about 66% of that, $660 million. There's no doubt about that Zelle reimburses at a much lower rate, but it's really just a service. It's a software that they sell to the banks to allow for peer-to-peer payment. I guess the other way to transact business is cash, but people don't carry cash, so if they want instantaneous transaction, if they don't want to pay an interchange fee, apparently they use these peer-to-peer services, and they want to do it for speed. They want to do it to avoid that interchange fee. And as a result, a company like Zelle just doesn't have the hundreds of billions of dollars in interchange fee profits to reimburse. Now, it does appear that they reimburse for unauthorized, or at least some unauthorized purchases, but there is a fair amount of friction. There's many steps you have to go through to actually have that money transferred, and it really is, to a certain extent, caveat emptor. I mean, I'll say caveat, we'll sell that user beware. When you're transferring money through these peer-to-peer, the money's gone inside of your checking account, and it's going to be very difficult to recover. So the only way you get reimbursed is literally comes out of the hide of the banks. And for the chairman to say that you ought to extend the same protections that credit card companies do, again, they don't have the profits off of this system. They don't have the interchange fees, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of interchange fees to use that as a cost of business. That's what the banks and the credit card companies view it as. So this is a different system. Again, we need to be concerned about scams and fraud, but there's a fair amount of responsibility on the part of the users to try and prevent that. And I know we've got some people that have been scammed. Again, I've heard some things that I understand why people all of a sudden quick transfer money. They've got a loved one in trouble. It's despicable. These are crimes that are being committed against them. But to necessarily blame a company that's providing a service without huge financial rewards, like the interchange fees, again, I'm not sure that's realistic to expect. But anyway, I'm interested in listening to testimony and hear what people have to say about this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Johnson. I'm going to introduce the witnesses. Stephanie Tater of the Tater Law Firm is a consumer rights attorney who has represented clients across the country in disputes against credit reporting agencies, debt collectors, and financial institutions for almost 2 decades. Ariana Duval is a rising senior at North Carolina A&T State University. Earlier this month, Ariana was targeted by a Zelle scam that claimed to offer her employment as a university research assistant. She ultimately lost $2,400 to that fraudulent scheme. John Rayo is the Vice President of Public Policy, Telecommunications, and Fraud at the National Consumers League. He is a prominent advocate for stronger consumer protections, particularly related to technology, data security, privacy, and more. Ann Humphreys is a retiree from Laurel, Maryland, and a grandmother of 5. In 2022, Ms. Humphreys' 94-year-old mother was scammed out of $3,500 on Zelle, and she's here to share her family story and their struggle. Delicia Hand of Consumer Reports is the Senior Director of Digital Marketplace, where she leads the development of testing frameworks, standards, and policies in the digital marketplace. She previously served for 10 years at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in various roles. Our custom is to swear witnesses, so if you would please rise and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. We will begin with witness statements, beginning with Ms. Tater.
Good afternoon, Chairman Blumenthal and Ranking Member Johnson. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today about Zelle fraud. I'm very glad to see that we have two consumers on the panel today. I myself had hoped to bring clients to be present to humanize the term victim for you, but consumers unfortunately are reluctant to testify against banks about Zelle fraud because they're either forced into private arbitration proceedings, which aren't available for public review and which consumers can't appeal, or because of protective orders entered during litigation which prevent the disclosure of significant information showing what the banks do or don't do to comply with the Electronic Funds Transfer Act, or because consumers are forced to sign confidential settlement agreements, and which also further prohibit them from continuing their banking relationships with the defendant institutions and their affiliates. These are some of the largest banks in America, and they dominate the credit card markets. So not only are the consumers forced to file lawsuits to make those banks comply with the laws, they are then punished by doing so. So consumers are scared to speak up. And if you don't hear directly from a lot of consumers, please don't take that as a sign that Zelle fraud is not important to consumers. Lack of consumer participation in hearings such as this is due to the shroud of secrecy financial institutions impose on consumers. Zelle fraud is pervasive, and it is ever evolving, and it is the gateway consumer financial crime which often leads to other bank fraud like wire transfers, which are largely unchecked by current laws. Criminals employ various tactics such as AI-generated voice impersonating phone calls spoofing bank phone numbers, SIM card hacking, and exploiting data breaches to gain access to bank accounts and initiate unauthorized Zelle transfers. Criminals are constantly 2 steps ahead of banks when perpetrating their fraud schemes and miles ahead of consumers who are left to carry the burden of undoing the damage that is done to them. And please take note, I do not mean to say that damage that is done to their bank accounts. I mean that the cost of Zelle fraud is not simply the dollar amount that's taken from the consumer. There is also a significant emotional and mental component to this fraud. Most Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. The funds that are stolen from them are allocated for specific living expenses like rent and transportation. Can you imagine? Would you please imagine what you would do if 75% of your checking account balance was gone because of Zelle fraud? And then think about the impact if you're a retiree who's no longer in a position to enter the workforce and make up those losses. After Zelle fraud happens, consumers live with the ripple effect of this fraud every minute of every hour of every day, countless sleepless nights for months on end, worrying, wondering, stressing, waiting for banks to do their jobs, to do an investigation and agree that fraud was committed so that they can get their money back. These consumers lose money in the blink of an eye, but it takes weeks, months, and even years to get their money back if they're lucky. Banks often refuse to conduct investigations, or they delay investigations into Zelle fraud because they request consumers to complete paperwork or file police reports, contrary to their duty under the Electronic Funds Transfer Act. Their investigations are superficial at best, lacking thorough record reviews or inquiries. Banks appear to prioritize proving transactions occurred rather than verifying that they were authorized by consumers, also against the Electronic Funds Transfer Act. Crucial evidence, such as the addition of new recipients with random names that are sequences of numbers or letters, the addition of unfamiliar devices or IP addresses, and unusual transaction patterns are frequently disregarded. Banks neglect to analyze past spending habits, rendering their investigations mere perfunctory examinations of limited information, falling far short of what the EFTA requires. Senators, if you are truly interested in effecting change, if financial institutions really want to do better, the first step is to stop thinking of consumers as account numbers or names written in black and white. Educating consumers is not a solution because you are unfairly putting the onus on every consumer to stay ahead of fraud that not even the banks can keep up with. The solutions must include safeguards to flag suspicious activity, delaying payments, putting an end to rampant victim-blaming financial institutions employ, demanding that banks investigate all unauthorized transactions. Banks must spread the risk of Zelle fraud between the sending bank and the receiving bank, and we must also demand transparency. Banks get away with these shoddy investigations because so few people know exactly what happens behind closed doors. Banks must be held to an EFTA-compliant standard because they are, after all, the custodians of consumers' hard-earned money. Thank you for hearing me out today on this critical issue, and I appreciate your attention and consideration of necessary reforms that need to protect consumers from the devastating impacts of Zelle fraud.
Thank you so much, Ms. Duval.
Hi. On the afternoon of May 1st, I applied to a research position from an email I received on April 30th. I believe the hiring manager to be a research professor at my university. After applying via email, by providing my resume, I received follow-up questions. For example, how would you rate your communication skills? Are you a U.S. citizen? And do you have prior research experience? I was then informed that I passed the criminal and academic background screenings. Further instructions from that email confirmed that office supplies would be needed for the position, and I would be sent a check, which I would then need to provide to the sales representative who is responsible for ordering the supplies on my behalf. I received a check in the form of a PDF on May 2nd through an email that presented itself as the payroll department at my university. It actually had the .edu domain presented in the email address. I was given specific instructions to print the check and do a mobile deposit only. Once I deposited the check into my account, the $400 was available immediately on May 3rd, while the $2,000 would be available the following day. I informed the fictitious professor of this and was told to Zelle the money as it became available. I was provided this name and email address of the sales representative and asked to send a screenshot of it with confirmation code. I did as instructed and sent the $400 on May 3rd, followed by the $2,000 on May 4th. Both are listed as pending in my bank account, which I informed the fictitious professor of. At that point, I was told that the sales representative would wait until it's confirmed before shipping the office research supplies. My mother observed something strange with my account, so she called me to figure out what was going on. After asking me several questions, my mother helped me to understand and realize that I was scammed. She told me to contact the bank and file a fraud claim. I called the bank immediately and explained the entire situation to the bank representative. With the representative's assistance, I filed 2 fraud claims, one for the $2,000 and another for the $400. I was told that an investigation would be conducted and I would receive a call back from the bank with a status update. On May 7th, I woke up and was preparing for one of my final exams when I checked my bank account and found that I was in a deficit for the $2,400 that I was scammed into receiving and sending off. I was devastated. In addition to the 5 major final projects that I had due for 4 courses within the last 2 weeks of the school year, where my money was already getting low and I was stressed out of my mind staying up late to complete, I now found myself in debt for the very first time in my life. All of this as a result of just wanting to work and have a job with flexible hours to accommodate my summer internship. After reporting to my university's police, they told me to report it to the FBI. I was told by the police that I was the only student that was actually financially impacted by this phishing scam, but I learned the following week that I was not. I reported my situation to the FBI, and my mother and I called the bank to see if there was any feasibility that I would be reimbursed for the $2,400 that I was scammed out of. Although we never received a call back from the bank on the investigation that they were doing, we were informed at that time that both fraudulent claims were denied. I returned back to campus to complete one of my projects. After returning back to my room, I filed 2 fraud claims with Zelle for the $2,000 and $400. In the process of filing those claims, the online Zelle form asked for a Zelle payment ID. There was a note in the FAQ section that if you submitted the Zelle payment via your bank's app and did not know what the Zelle payment ID was, to contact their bank partner that I was affiliated with. I called my bank asking for the Zelle payment ID. However, I was transferred to several representatives from multiple departments, including the Zelle department. None of them were aware of what a Zelle payment was or where to find it. I called Zelle's customer service line and was automatically put through to an automated machine, which hung up on me after I was told if I'm affiliated with Zelle through one of their bank partners to contact the bank. I could not get through to a human representative at all after calling Zelle multiple times. Within this frustration, as the Zelle payment ID was supposed to be a total of 12 digits, I ended up putting the confirmation codes of the Zelle payments with 2 additional zeros in the front. This seemed to work as the forms were submitted, and I completed both of those forms only to receive a submission of the forms in my email. I still have yet to hear back from Zelle, and my bank denied both of my online fraud claims. I just want to get my money back, and more importantly, prevent this from happening to anybody else. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Duval. Mr. Breo.
Good afternoon, Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the subcommittee. My name is John Breo, and I'm the Vice President of Public Policy, Telecommunications, and Fraud at the National Consumers League. Founded in 1899, NCL is the nation's pioneering consumer and worker advocacy organization. For more than 25 years, NCL has worked via our fraud.org campaign to educate consumers about the warning signs of fraud and promote public policies that protect the American public from fraud of all kinds. Senators, fraud in the United States has reached a crisis point. In 2023, the FTC received 5.4 million complaints about fraud and identity theft, a 54% year-over-year increase versus 2019, with total annual losses of more than $10 billion. And as sobering as those numbers are, they are just the tip of the iceberg. A 2023 FTC report estimated that true annual fraud losses were more than $137 billion annually. The costs of fraud are not just financial. Many fraud victims report struggling with mental health issues after the event. Sadly, some scam victims have even committed suicide due to the trauma. Peer-to-peer or P2P payment services play a significant role in this problem. In 2022, 4 in 10 Americans reported using a P2P service at least once a month, with 18% using them at least once a week. As P2P usage has grown, so too have fraud losses. Last year, reported losses to the FTC hit $210 million, with more than 65,000 complaints in this category. The true losses by consumers to criminal fraudsters via P2P platforms is likely well into the multiple billions of dollars every year. While fraud occurs on all major P2P platforms, fraud on Zelle poses unique concerns. First, Zelle can be used to transfer funds between anyone with a U.S. bank account at a participating financial institution. Indeed, the widespread availability of Zelle to millions of bank customers is exactly why it has become such an attractive payment method for criminal fraudsters. Second, because Zelle is in competition with PayPal, Venmo, and Cash App for transaction volume, any voluntary action that makes it harder to use because of additional anti-fraud requirements is likely to put Zelle at a competitive disadvantage to its competitors. While no payment system is immune from fraud, the scale of fraud on the Zelle platform is unacceptably high. Just 4 banks on the Zelle platform were reportedly on pace to receive scam and fraud claims in excess of $255 million in 2022. This is likely only a small fraction of the total fraud losses. Based on current Zelle growth rates and reported fraud rates of 6 to 9 basis points, it is estimated that total fraud rates on Zelle will likely exceed $1 billion annually by next year. Even when consumers recognize and report this fraud to their banks, their claims are denied in the vast majority of cases. The 3 banks who provided their fraud reimbursement rates to Senator Warren's office reported reimbursing only 10% of such scam claims. Because these authorized transactions, even if all parties involved agree fraud was involved, they are not covered under the Electronic Funds Transfer Act's Regulation E liability protections. These losses end up being borne by those who are least able to afford them, individual consumers. Warning messages and consumer education will not and have not put a meaningful dent in fraud rates. Indeed, we hear from victims of fraud that the scammers are incredibly adept at coaching their marks around consumer warnings the banks provide. Scammers get cleverer and more innovative every day. Expecting everyday consumers to accurately spot and resist fraudulent schemes run by sophisticated, professional criminals is unlikely to yield a more secure P2P payment system. To put a meaningful dent in fraud on Zelle and other P2P platforms, Congress must create new incentives for the banks and P2P platforms to invest in more security. Fortunately, a bill to create these incentives, the Protecting Consumers from Payment Scams Act, has already been released by Congresswoman Maxine Waters. The bill would expand the definition of unauthorized electronic fund transfer in EFTA to cover fraudulently induced payments. This simple fix would address fraudulently induced payments on all payment platforms covered by EFTA, including P2P apps and gift cards. Such a solution would not be unprecedented. Recently enacted rules in the United Kingdom require banks to reimburse victims of fraud in the inducement, with issuing and receiving banks sharing liability for making victims whole. The UK's rules can be a model for law in this area. Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the subcommittee, we thank you for your continuing work to protect consumers and for holding this hearing. On behalf of the National Consumers League and consumers like the two sitting next to me across the country, thank you for including the consumer perspective as you consider these important issues.
Thank you, Mr. Breo. Ms. Humphrey.
Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Johnson, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to testify about a sophisticated scam that targeted my family. My name is Ann Humphreys, and I live in Laurel, Maryland. Unfortunately, the type of fraud that happened to my family is all too common, and I believe my testimony can shed light on the tactics used by scammers and the urgent need for stronger consumer protections. On the morning of February 7th, 2022, I arrived at my mother's Baltimore County house around 11 o'clock, where her caregiver came to the door and said, "Your brother is in trouble." I found my mom on the phone with someone claiming to be my brother. Mom saw me and said to the caller, "Here's Ann, talk to her." Thinking this was my brother in trouble, I was horrified to hear the story. He was in a terrible auto accident, his fault, and the other driver, who was pregnant, was in critical condition. He was in a courthouse in Virginia facing arrest and jail time. To explain why his voice sounded different than in normal, he said that he had inhaled airbag chemicals, which were causing him breathing difficulties. The caller knew enough details about my family members to be believable, and he appeared to be quite scared. He had answers to questions I hadn't even thought to ask. He then asked me to call his supposed lawyer, Mark Ross, who said it was urgent that I post bond so that my brother would avoid jail time. Throughout the day, I had multiple phone and text exchanges with Mark Ross, who gave seemingly plausible answers to all my questions. Mark Ross told me he needed a huge amount of money in cash, which I told him I couldn't put my hands on. I frantically tried to figure out how to get money to the bond company. He asked me if I had access to any online payment apps like Cash App or Zelle. I was familiar with Zelle, using it regularly through Wells Fargo to pay for my mother's caregivers. I agreed to make a transfer with Zelle and was instructed to use it to send $3,500 to someone named Elenis Jimenez at the bond company. That was enough to begin the process to have my brother released. So I was able to send the $3,500 to Elenis Jimenez through Zelle. I discovered the fraud around 5 o'clock that evening. My real brother stopped on his way home from work to see my mother. She told him what had been going on, and he called me immediately. So I stopped communicating with Mark Ross, who I had also been communicating with because there was additional bail money I was to come up with. But I stopped communicating with him, and I was devastated. Looking back on it, there were red flags. For example, why didn't the supposed lawyer Mark Ross offer a secure legal payment system? Why wouldn't he accept PayPal, which I had initially offered? Why did he accept Zelle? And why was bond being posted to an individual and not a business? In that moment, however, my mom and I were very afraid for my brother's well-being, and the scammers who targeted us were very good at making the situation seem real and urgent. I think what happened to us could happen to anyone. Unfortunately, trying to recover from this crime has proven to be almost as traumatic as the crime itself. There seems to be no recourse for our loss. I immediately called Wells Fargo. I spoke to a representative in the fraud department and described what had taken place. I gave him names, phone numbers, and addresses. He sympathized with me and told me it sure sounded like fraud. He said they would investigate it and I'd have an answer within 10 days. 10 days went by without any updates or communication. I called Wells Fargo repeatedly. I still thought I was going to get our money back. On March 10th, my claim was denied. They said I had processed the transaction successfully and there was no fault found. Within 24 hours of the scam, I had filed paperwork with the FTC and the local police. Neither of them gave me any reason to think that they were going to be able to resolve this case. In fact, both of them just told me, we'll take this information in case we get those numbers on a hit someplace else. Looking back on it, Wells Fargo's website did have warnings about sending payments to people, similar to, make sure you have the right number, because once it's sent, it's gone. But there were no big warnings like there are now. Not long after this scam happened to us, Wells Fargo did send updated notices for Zelle transfers, spelling out that they aren't responsible for certain electronic transfers. None of that existed when we were defrauded. And now they ask you a ton of questions before you can send money via Zelle to a new user, so they know what's going on. Still, though, they have no financial accountability. My questions are these. If Wells Fargo knew there were no consumer protections on Zelle, why did and do they offer it to their consumers? And since Wells Fargo, along with Bank of America and the other major banks, have financial interest in Zelle, why don't they have financial accountability for the protection of their customers? Why is Zelle even allowed to operate this way, knowing the high probability of fraud? I feel taken twice by the scammers and by Wells Fargo and Zelle. Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Johnson, I share my story to raise awareness and to advocate for stronger safeguards. The emotional and financial toll of this scam on my family was significant, and it is still being felt. And I'm sure I'm just one of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of consumers who are being targeted this way. Action by you and your colleagues here in Congress is urgently needed to stop these scammers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Humphries. Ms. Hand.
Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on this critical issue of consumer protection in the peer-to-peer marketplace. My name is Delicia Hand, and I work for Consumer Reports, where for 88 years we ensured that consumer marketplaces, products, and services are safe, fair, and just. In 2022, Consumer Reports conducted a comparative evaluation of 4 of the most widely used P2P payment apps: Apple Cash, Cash App, Venmo, and Zelle. Our study, published in 2023, found that all 4 services lack clear, accessible disclosures about the availability of FDIC insurance and the full scope of their fraud and error resolution policies. Notably, Zelle stood out for providing the least comprehensive information to users about their rights and protections. There are several aspects of Zelle's business model which create unique risks for users compared to other P2P services. For example, there aren't clear published fraud liability policies. Unlike Venmo or Cash App, Zelle does not have a public-facing policy detailing consumer protections and reimbursement rights for all unauthorized transactions. So as you've heard, this leaves victims unclear on where to turn for help. As you've also heard, they provide a fragmented customer service experience. The support is split between the network operator and participating banks, which can bounce victims back and forth. A centralized, consistent process is needed to help consumers when they fall victim to fraud and scams. There are also weaker authorization safeguards. Zelle enables instant transfers, as you've heard, with less upfront friction. It's less secure and can enable faster fraud compared to other P2P apps, which employ in-app two-factor and multi-factor authentication. Additionally, there's lack of transparent data. Zelle does not regularly publish statistics on the volume and resolution of fraud and scam complaints. This hinders effective oversight of how well its policies are working. In the context of increasingly sophisticated scams, particularly those leveraging the most advanced technologies such as generative AI, it is increasingly difficult for consumers to detect and avoid fraud. Scammers can create highly convincing deepfake videos impersonating individuals known to the victims and deceiving them into transferring large sums of money, as you've heard from today's consumers. In such cases, a consumer who sends money under duress cannot said to have truly authorized that payment in any meaningful sense. And the scale of this issue is significant. In the US, consumers reported losing over $10 billion to fraud in 2023, representing a 14% increase from the previous year. Bank transfers and payments, which include P2P transactions, accounted for $1.86 billion in losses. To better protect consumers, we recommend that Zelle and participating banks adopt and publish a clear policy guaranteeing reimbursement for all unauthorized transactions, including fraud in the inducement. We also recommend implementing stronger transaction monitoring and identity verification safeguards, creating a streamlined process for consumers to report fraud and seek reimbursement so that they don't have to bounce between the bank and Zelle. We recommend providing greater transparency about fraud trends and reimbursement rates, and additionally, that banks establish a robust framework for sharing fraud information across the industry. Congress should also clarify through legislation that Regulation E applies to fraudulently induced payments, not just unauthorized transfers. Because as financial services grow more complex and scams become more sophisticated, it is banks, not consumers, who are best positioned to prevent and absorb losses from fraud. Just as manufacturers are expected to implement robust safety measures and bear the costs of product defects, banks should also be required to invest in advanced fraud prevention technologies and reimburse consumers for losses resulting from increasingly sophisticated scams. We look forward to working with the subcommittee, industry stakeholders, and consumer advocates to create a fair and sustainable P2P payment ecosystem that truly protects consumers while harnessing the benefits of fast, convenient movement of money. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Ms. Hand. We're going to have questions now, 7-minute rounds. We've also just begun a vote. So Senator Johnson has gone to vote. When he comes back, I'll go to vote, but we're going to keep the hearing going. And I understand that Senator Butler has another obligation she needs to attend, so I'm going to call on her first.
I so appreciate the flexibility, Chairman Blumenthal, and thank you so much for having this hearing. And it's just another demonstration of your career of public service as a consumer advocate, really showing up for the American people. Thank you all for coming here. Ms. Duvall, Ms. Humphreys, for sharing, what I think a lot more people have gone through and tend to keep to themselves because they're ashamed. They think that how could they have fallen for this? But the fact that the two of you have come here representing such a diversity of both experience, geography, and community representation helps to give a face to the vulnerability of all communities to be targeted towards these scams. And even when they are trusted tools that show up on the device that we love the most, they are tools that should be interrogated, and we should be making sure as public servants that we are doing everything to put in place the protections that you need. Ms. Duvall, I would love to start with you just as a fellow HBCU graduate, making sure to lift up your courage of sharing, what happened to you, and I'm sure is not unfamiliar to others that you might know on campus or in and around your community. You spent, it seems like, a considerable amount of time trying to, with your mom, sort of figure out a way to communicate, to over-communicate, and to communicate more. Can you just share a little bit? I read your written submitted testimony, even as I came in on the final bit of what you were offering. Could you share just a little bit more how you, or what you were able to find out relative to how these kinds of scams are directed towards, or were directed towards you and others on your campus, trying to get to that sort of student vulnerability population, and if there was any wider exposure to this kind of scam on your campus.
Yes, of course, and thank you, Senator Butler. I really appreciate that, and also HBCUs.
Shout them out, girl. Shout them out.
But yeah, I got the email first from my school account. I don't know how they got my school email accounts, and I recently learned today, actually, that 6 other students have been scammed the exact same way that I have. And with that, I guess they at first, they email us with the opening, presenting themselves as one of our actually head research professors, but ending with the @gmail.com kind of thing. And then they ask us to go to another email address to keep in contact with them. And that's when they start spoofing our payroll@ncat.edu email address, and that's how they further send those fictitious checks and then ask for that Zelle payments and things of that nature. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does, and it leads me right to my next one. Thank you for answering it so well. Ms. Hand, I would assume just in the ways in which Ms. Duvall was just talking about the sophisticated nature, the evolution of these scams, and in particular directed towards young people, and in some instances, young people of color, HBCU campuses. I wonder if in your research or in your engagement in the advocacy space, if there's any, or in advocacy and research space, if there's any information that you might have in terms of how much of this is directed towards young people and students, given the financial vulnerability of most young people, particularly when headed towards the end of the school year.
Thank you for the question. I can shed a little bit of light. So in addition to testing products, we also regularly engage consumers and do representative surveys of thousands of consumers across the country. So we're able to get a sense of various demographics. And what you do see is that the more vulnerable consumers tend to be targeted. And so you do see younger consumers, and you also see, frankly, the other end of the spectrum, older consumers who self-reporting that they are victims of fraud, various kinds of induced scams in these instances.
Thank you for that. And Ms. Tatar, is that the right way to pronounce that?
Close enough, Tater.
Well, I mean, as the woman with a PH and a Z in her name, I'd like to get it right. Ms. Tater, thank you for that. And is there, or Mr. Braille, would you add any additional insights or information from your perspective to this line of questioning relative to vulnerable communities, in particular students, particular time of year? There's so many commencements that are happening right now, and I think this is a time where we have the opportunity to get folks who are watching the 5 people who watch C-SPAN, but to really be able to get students to understand that they are a targeted audience and group of victims, particularly in this moment. So I'd open the question to both of you as well, and I'd love to start with Ms. Tater.
Thank you. My experience has been that students are probably more often targeted. You'll see that those numbers in greater numbers with that population. But the older generation, they're suffering larger losses, as significantly larger losses. And the trouble with that is they're losing money and they're not able to make that money back because they're retired or they're losing significant amounts of their retirement income. I do agree it's time for graduation. There are a lot of kids looking for jobs right now, and they are, through social engineering, they are targeted very by the hordes. Yes, absolutely.
And just to add on to what Ms. Tater had to say, certainly, we know that fraudsters look for specific vulnerabilities in specific target audiences they go after. And financial distress is one that we see very often. And so when we think of students, we often think of the stress that they're beginning to feel as student debt starts to cut into their what they have to spend money on. And so, as in Ms. Duvall's case, the offer of employment looks very promising to someone who is thinking about having to start paying those student loans off. And the scammers know this, and they target their scripts to prey on people who might be vulnerable in that way. So they have a script literally for every potential audience, from older people to younger people to everyone in between.
Thank you all again for being here and for offering your testimony here. I think it's just such a critically important issue. And I think it was noted, Ms. Humphreys, in the end of your statement, the fact that this is a product that is majority owned by the largest financial institutions really does make it imperative for not only the sharing of your stories, but the action of our subcommittee and Congress to do everything that we can to protect the American consumer of every bit of the age and experience spectrum. So thank you all for being here, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Butler. Ms. Tater, about 3/4 of the fraud claims are never reimbursed. Can you explain why?
Much to the chagrin of consumer attorneys, it is because many banks believe that the Electronic Funds Transfer Act prohibits or eliminates their duty to do an investigation because the consumer participated in one way or the other in the fraud, meaning they were on the phone, they transferred the money, they clicked on a link, they clicked on a text message, and because ultimately they did something to perpetuate that movement of money, the banks are not responsible.
So Regulation E, they believe, doesn't apply to them, to use the technical legal terminology.
Correct, because the consumer had something to do with the movement of the money, they believe that the Electronic Funds Transfer Act, Regulation E, does not apply to them.
The mere fact that the consumer's finger was on the button disqualifies that consumer from any reimbursement.
As frustrating as that is, yes, that is exactly right.
Do you agree with them on the law?
Absolutely not.
And even if they continue with their, or especially if they do, with their resistance, perhaps that regulation ought to be clarified, correct?
I agree with you, Senator. Yes, the regulation absolutely needs to be clarified.
Mr. Breo, you mentioned that what we know about this problem is probably just the tip of the iceberg, because a lot of consumers either are ashamed or embarrassed to report this kind of fraud. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Senator.
And we know that $456 million was actually reported in 2022 alone. The numbers have been skyrocketing, so the number for 2023 is probably higher, and for 2024 will be even higher. But there's no indication, is there, that the levels of reimbursement have increased at all?
None that I've seen, no.
So probably it'll be at the same proportion.
I would anticipate yes.
Would it be advantageous to have more people report more of this fraud so we could know more accurately what the dimensions are?
It certainly would, Senator, yes.
How would we encourage it?
Well, I think that one of the ways that we can encourage consumers to report this fraud is by working with the media, with members of Congress, with the banks themselves to destigmatize this. Unfortunately, we often use terms like I was duped, or I can't believe I fell for this, or how could I be so stupid? And consumers hear this whenever they share their stories, and this really creates a culture of fear around reporting. And unfortunately, that trickles down into the resources that businesses and law enforcement devote to actually going after these scammers.
Ms. Humphreys and Ms. Duval, let me ask you, were you reluctant to come forward? Was there a
yes.
disincentive? Were you discouraged about it, either because of your own emotions or because of the way the system worked?
Yes, I responded to a Consumer Reports email and thought that was it. I said, yes, I'd been scammed. I thought that was finished with that. And then Consumer Reports said, well, can we tell it to the Congress? And I said, oh, I don't know. And so here I am. I was very reluctant because I am ashamed. I only told my children last night when I shared with them the link because I didn't want to share that with them.
And the cost to you, regardless of the reimbursement, perhaps you could talk about those costs to you in emotional or psychological terms, to you and your mother.
Well, my mother's only concern was my brother. She didn't care what it cost. She wanted that done. And so she was happy. 94 years old, her son's in trouble, and now her son's on his way home. And then when he arrived at her house that night, she was thrilled because it had worked until he told her, I was never in trouble. I don't know what's going on. So she was just happy that her son was okay. I, on the other hand, was ashamed that I had fallen for this. And I asked questions as it went, but I was so caught up into it, I couldn't get out of my own emotions. I didn't know where to turn because I wanted him out of that space. And so when the lawyer said to me, you know, can you get me some cash? I'm thinking, cash? Who has cash like that? But he lowered my bail, or my brother's bail, and for that I was grateful. So as I'm reviewing all this, I'm thinking, you know, he had my emotions in his fingertips. As I asked a question and he said, well, I'd have to go to the court and ask them if they'll accept that. I'm waiting, and the time is passing. My brother is in jail. I'm trying to get him home, and I'm waiting for the lawyer to get an answer for something. So I was completely invested in the trouble here. And so when it was all said and done, I'm thinking, what an idiot. I had all that opportunity for my brain to kick in and say, wait a minute, now what? But I couldn't. I didn't have that in me to think anything except I got to get my brother home. And so that has been overriding most everything. It took me a very long time to forgive myself. And I thought I had until you all asked me to respond to this. And so now I'm reliving it. And I'm, again, ashamed. And I know that people watching are going, I would never fall for that. Which honestly is how I felt about myself when I watched other people report on their scam. How could they have fallen for that? What a dumbbell. And then I fall for it. And so there's been a great humility on my part to realize that none of us are immune to this. Those of you who haven't done this, and you're sitting here thinking, boy, she's old and she's dumb. But you just wait when that time comes, and you get so caught up into something, you can't do anything except respond to it. And so I did tell my children last night, and most of them were supportive. I haven't heard from some. But it is a hard thing to come and express your vulnerability. And when it's money involved, and it was my mother's money. I'm on account with her, but it was my mother's money. I couldn't let my mother suffer that loss. So I gave her the $3,500. So it's now my loss, and my husband's loss. But I couldn't see another way out of it. And so that's what I mean. The financial toll is there. I still lost the $3,500, but the emotional toll just continues. And so that's
Very
awful.
well said. You know, just an observation, Zelle has instantaneous or near instantaneous clearing in Venmo. these transactions take, I believe, 1 to 3 days to settle. So your brother would have come home that evening, and you would have been able to reverse
Yes,
the transaction
right.
because of the delay. Now, I recognize people want everything to happen quicker in today's society. Faster is always better, right? Well, not always.
Right.
And especially if you're paying a bill, faster is not always better if the bill is fraudulent. I'm going to ask Ms. Duval the same questions. Were you fearful or reluctant to come forward, and what were the costs to you beyond the financial loss?
Yes, definitely. More so than even the financial part at times. Because I go to a university, and it can feel like a family at times whenever you tell them about your experience, and especially that I'm out of $2,400, they're like, how on earth could you fall for that? Even some of my own family members had the same sort of tone with me with that same thing. And it felt disheartening. I felt like Mrs. Humphrey was saying, that I'm a big Dumbo. How could I even fall for this? And it took a toll on my self-esteem, just my intelligence in general, seeing as I tried my best in my academic pursuits. And it made me feel as if I was the only one that could go through this. Now that I've recently learned that I am definitely not the only one from my own school that has been involved with this scam now, I feel more seen. And when I went to ABC 11 at first, I felt as if I could help anyone just to prevent this in general, I would, because I had to overcome that. But I know whenever you would close the door and I'd just be alone in my room, I'd cry. I'd really cry, and I'd sit there and like, how on earth did this happen in this short amount of time? I had my final exams and my final projects, some of the most strenuous and difficult that I've done throughout my entire school career. And it was just so disheartening. I was actually devastated. It was just too much piling onto me at once. I felt like I couldn't talk to anybody because they wouldn't understand or they would scrutinize me. And so that's why I'm here. I want to let you know that, having the courage to speak up, number one, is one thing, but to know that you are seen and that you're not alone in this.
Well, we thank you both for being here, and your statements are very, very powerful. Senator Johnson has returned. I'm going to go vote, and I will be back as quickly as my feet will take me, because I do have some more questions for all of you, and I apologize that we had this interruption, but I'm going to leave it in Senator Johnson's very capable hands.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Ms. Duval and Ms. Humphries, thanks for your testimony. And I think all of us are just thinking there, but the grace of God, go, okay. No way should you feel inadequate or, these are very sophisticated criminals, and they are preying on people's emotions. They preyed on yours. And I find it totally understandable in terms of, how they took advantage of you. But I do have first couple questions for you, Ms. Duval. So the $400 check that they sent you was just a fraudulent check as well, right? I mean, you deposited it in good faith. You thought the money went in there. It probably takes a while for the bank to get back to you and say, hey, this is no good. I mean, can you just fill me in on that first?
Yes, and in addition, it was a $2,400 check in total, and
so they send you two checks then, one for $400 and also the $2,000.
no, it all came into one check of $2,400, and it was all fictitious. Sorry, can you repeat the question again? The one that you just asked.
No, I'm just, so you got these checks.
Yeah.
And they look like valid checks to you. Mm-hmm. Did you take them physically, or did you also deposit those electronically?
I deposited those electronically. It gave me strict instructions to do mobile deposit only, and that's how they first came into my account. And whenever I first realized it was a scam, my bank was telling me that it takes them 5 to 7 days to realize the validity of a check. So it would appear in my account while still pending, but they would basically give me that money.
Right. Right. So when did you find out that those checks were also fraudulent and you didn't have the $2,400? How many days did that take?
It was around, I believe, just 2 days or a day, because it wasn't myself that realized it. It was my mother seeing my account and realizing something weird was going on, and she called me and then made me realize that it was a scam. And this was before I was even in the deficit or they took the money out. I just knew I was scammed at that point, and then I filed a claim with 2 claims for the $400 and $2,000. Within that same hour, I realized, and then 3 days later, I was in deficit.
Now, I don't believe you'd ever used Zelle before, right?
I used it maybe once or twice just for simple transactions with actual peers that I know and friends. It's for simple things like some food.
So why did you use it? Again, this isn't an accusatory thing, because I've never used these things. I know people who have, and I just never have. So why do people use these?
I believe just because of its quick pace in nature and how maybe effective it could go into the bank account, especially since it is bank affiliated directly. That's what it made me feel as if it was more trustworthy in that
Right.
aspect.
Yeah, so it's going through your bank, and you figure this, okay.
Yeah, and especially for this situation, since I did think it was somebody from my school and they needed these research office supplies to send to me so I could use this for this research opportunity, that they would need it specifically in their bank, because Cash App can take some time to actually go into the bank. I think Venmo is the same way, a couple days or 3 days. So I think that whenever I was thinking about it, that if you could have that instantaneously, that would be okay, and that because it's also bank affiliated, that if it was not, that I could get that back easier.
And again, you're not thinking, because no consumer really thinks about the interchange fees or anything else like that. I mean, you're just simply not, a credit card wasn't available in this situation. They were telling you to use this direct payment, and you'd used it in the past, and just really didn't question it at all.
I mean, I would say, I'm a bit confused in the way you said it, but because they sent a check, I thought, okay, this money's not my own.
It's
They
covered,
won't be-
right?
Yeah, and they brought it to me so I could send it off to the sales
Yeah.
representative.
No, again,
That's the only
they're very good at what they do.
Yeah.
So, Ms. Humphrey, maybe you can answer that question too. So you said you had used PayPal in the past, I think, right?
Yes, I use PayPal to buy things.
Yeah, turn your,
Yes, I use PayPal to buy things, and I have bought some fraudulent things, and PayPal is very good about refunding my money. During COVID, I bought something, and it came back completely it wasn't what I purchased. And I told PayPal about it. They made me whole, and I sent the stuff back, and it was
so why do you
fine.
use PayPal rather than a credit card to purchase things, what, on Amazon, that type of thing?
Yeah, it was Amazon.
So why do you use PayPal versus credit cards?
Sometimes I use PayPal because I can cover my credit card number against the company that's making the purchase. So if I use PayPal, I don't have to put my Discover card into the place where it says make payment. So it's kind of a one-step, my understanding of it is it's one step away from giving some company I'm not familiar with my credit card number. I can give the company my PayPal account, and then the company gets its money from the PayPal account, and PayPal knows my account number. So I can keep my Discover or whatever card away from them.
Right, so
it's-
you have an account at PayPal.
Yes.
PayPal has access to your bank
That's
account.
correct.
And,
That's
okay,
correct.
so that makes
So I
sense.
offered that to this guy, and he wouldn't take it. Well, now I know why he wouldn't take it.
Right.
Because, hello, it wouldn't have
Yeah, it
worked.
was cheating you.
Yeah, but I use Zelle for my mother's caregivers, and I would have to pay them over and over and over again. And it always worked fine until this, and then I became very skeptical of it, and so I began to I'd send $1. Is this you? And they'd come back and say, yes, I got it. And then I would send them, the amount of money to cover. So it has changed my already heightened distrust of electronic payment, but to a whole new level.
No, listen, I think you're very responsible, and your rationale for using PayPal makes an awful lot of sense. Rather than give that, we do it, my wife does it, you're just kind of hoping.
Right.
But we do know with credit cards, if there's a fraudulent payment,
Correct.
they reimburse that. But again, they have hundreds of billions of dollars in profit off the interchange fees to make those payments. So I think that's, I'll go to Ms. Hand right now, because I want to understand.
Could I finish that
Go
little
ahead.
thought then? But that might be your thought on it, but mine as a consumer is I don't care about any of that stuff.
Well, I understand.
I was working through Wells Fargo, which offered me a service, and so Wells Fargo should be backing up that service. And
Right.
the rest of that financial stuff, I don't care about that.
I completely understand that. I understand, you want to be made whole and.
Correct.
But again, I'm just looking at the overall business models of these things and, who has the wherewithal to make those reimbursements. And that's why I want to kind of get into these other systems, because I want to compare them with Ms. Hand. Can you compare, what is the difference between PayPal, Venmo, and Zelle? Can you just kind of lay out what are the differences there? And speak as loud as possible.
Sure. So I think one of the things that you've heard from various testimony is the friction, both the presence of it and the absence of it. And so one of the things that is more absent in Zelle is that absence of friction.
Okay,
right?
so that's the
It's
use of it. So
instantaneous.
I want to,
Yeah,
I
but
want
that
to
is
focus,
a
I want
part
to
of the
focus on the
business
difference in
model.
the business model. Okay? So PayPal, how do they make money?
That's a really good question. How these companies make money is not part of our analysis. We test the consumer use
Okay.
of it.
Does anybody know the business model difference between PayPal, Venmo, and Zelle? Mr. Revolt.
So, Senator, what I understand about the business models is that Zelle is basically a service that the banks offer as a way to basically make their service more attractive, to make it stickier so that you get other services from the banks.
So the
like-
people don't use PayPal and Venmo.
So, right. If people
Is that, do the banks view PayPal and Venmo as a competitor?
yes, they do.
Okay.
and so-
and apparently the parent company, they claim they make no money off of Zelle whatsoever.
Right, and while that might be true that there's not sort of the same kind of fees they get off of interchange like they would in credit or debit, they do make money in other ways. For example, by using Zelle, it's a service that gets you to stay on your bank's website, for example, where you might
And that's
be-
why the banks use Zelle.
Right, right.
okay.
Venmo and PayPal make money in other ways. So, for
So
example,
how do they make money other ways?
PayPal may make money off of, for example, charging you a fee if you want to send money to a business, for example, or if you want to, the money that are in people's PayPal's balances, they make money off the
So
investment.
they have compensating balances then.
By compensating balances, if you mean they're making money off the float on the balances, then yes.
So what float is, do both PayPal and Venmo, do they allow their users to deposit money so it doesn't even have to go through a bank account?
That's right.
Okay, so they're making money like a bank does. They have deposits on hand. They don't pay interest on it probably, right?
on Venmo, not that I know of.
Yeah. So they've got this cash that they can go ahead and make money on themselves.
Right.
So that kind of funds it. Well, Zelle doesn't do that, right? Zelle is just basically a software program that banks use so that their banking customers stay on their platform. They don't take their money and deposit it into Venmo and PayPal. That's kind of how I view this, right?
And there are other apps as well. There's a very popular one called Cash App, where you're incented to use your Cash App balance to do things like purchase cryptocurrency. So there are various P2P apps. They have various business models. But your understanding of how Zelle operates is I believe, correct.
Okay. Again, the reason I'm pointing this out is if let's say we want to pass a law, and I'm going to get to the law in terms of the Electronic Transfer Act, that is going to redefine unauthorized transactions, which I think is covered under that electronic, but I don't think fraud is. That's why Congresswoman Waters has this bill to include fraud. Somebody's going to have to pay for that. And the way you'd probably have to pay for that is Zelle or these other companies would probably have to charge fees so they have a amount of money to compensate people. There will be a certain percentage of fraud. There always will be. And so somehow somebody's going to have to pay. It's going to come out of somebody's hide, and my guess is then those services will have to charge some kind of slight transaction fee or whatever. But, Ms. Tater.
Senator, if I could just respond on that point.
Sure.
Right now that money is coming out of somebody's hide. It's coming out of the hide of consumers like the one sitting next to me.
Right.
And so whether that the fraud is happening and the money is being lost by somebody, our opinion is that those losses are best absorbed by the banks and those costs spread across their entire Zelle network rather than coming out of the pocketbooks.
And by the way, I completely agree, but it's how do you set up the system so it works? Ms. Tater, so why do you believe, because you said a couple times in your testimony that Zelle's not following the law. But again, I don't know what percent, they do reimburse for unauthorized use. And again, I don't know whether that comes out of Zelle, whether that comes out of the fees that Zelle charges the bank, and they do the calculation in terms of what percent of the transfers are unauthorized or they're going to have to reimburse. I mean, again, these people are smart. I mean, they keep track of these things. In what way is Zelle not following the law?
Senator, what I had said is that financial institutions routinely don't follow the law, and by that I mean the banks. I sue banks when they don't return the money to my consumers, and they routinely either don't do an investigation because they feel it's not covered under the Electronic Funds Transfer Act, or the investigations that they conduct are terrible.
Let's zero in on that. What is and what isn't covered? I mean, am I correct, as I've been briefed here, that unauthorized transaction is covered and they have to reimburse for that, which means they have to investigate. But if it's fraud, or if it's an authorized, and again, that's the problem with fraud, it's you were defrauded, crime was committed, but you authorized the transfer. So that, according to my briefing, is not covered under the Electronic Transfer Act, which is again why Congresswoman Waters has a bill that would include fraud covered under the Act. I mean, am I getting that wrong?
Not necessarily. So the term fraud's a little tricky. I think it's probably easier to think about it in terms of unauthorized transactions that a consumer's had a hand in by no fault of their own.
I got it, but I mean, what really scares certainly me is completely unauthorized, where people have access to your personal information. They have access to your checking account without knowledge whatsoever. You had no hand in it. I think that's actually pretty clear cut in terms of what's authorized or unauthorized. But then you have fraud that occurs and involves an authorized transaction. But I think Senator Marshall's ready here, so I'll let you go and I'll come back.
Okay, thank you, Senator Johnson. If my questions are repetitive, you'll have to forgive me. We've been bouncing back and forth from votes and other committees. So my first question for Mr. Brault, if you will. Look, I think all scams are bad, and consumers being taken advantage of is, of course, horrible as well. But sadly, it happens far too often and in all different forms. We see it with crypto scams, Western Union scams, gift card scams, just to name a few. Shouldn't we be focusing our attention on the actual scammers and not the specific medium that they're using?
Senator, thank you for the question. I don't believe it's an either-or proposition. I believe that we can redouble our efforts to go after scammers and try and put them behind bars. And one of the best ways to do that is to give the entities that are in their best position to help that happen the incentives they need to do so. And I believe that the entities that are best positioned to provide the kind of data to law enforcement they need are the banks. Currently, because the costs of the fraud that are occurring are not borne by the banks, they lack that incentive. And I think that is where Congress can step in. Just as Congress stepped in and made sure that the Electronic Funds Transfer Act had limited liability for credit and debit card customers. And now if you're anything like me, the last time you found out that a scammer got a hold of your credit card, it wasn't because you noticed a suspicious charge on your bank statement. It's because your bank called you and said, Senator, did you just spend $500 on a big screen TV in Los Angeles when you were just in Kansas the other day? You said no, you reimbursed the losses, and then you're provided a new card. We think that system works very well and has given consumers a lot of faith in credit and debit cards. And we think that same system could apply in peer-to-peer payments. But it doesn't...
And we should just let the scammers go on.
No, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that the best way to create systems and incentives for the banks who are in the best position to go after these scammers with the help of law enforcement is to give them the incentive, a financial incentive, to put skin in the game when it comes to going after these scammers. And that incentive structure has worked great in credit and debit, and I think it worked great in P2P.
Don't you think we could do more by going after the scammers, whether they're successful or not successful? It's like we let them try to rob the bank. If we don't catch them, if they don't rob the bank, we don't prosecute them. Don't you think there's more we can do to go after the scammers themselves?
Absolutely. There's always more we can do. We could fully fund the enforcement agencies that are responsible for going after those scammers, like the CFPB and the FTC. But it's not a zero-sum game.
But you would agree with me, even if we could shut down Zelle, or if we could make them scam-proof, these bad actors would just find another mechanism to do what they're doing. It's like a balloon. You push it in one place and the air comes out some other part of it.
Sure, they will undoubtedly look to other methods to get payment. We know that cryptocurrency, for example, is becoming a far bigger mechanism and venue for fraud. Gift cards are another way that scammers seek to get paid. But just because squeezing the balloon, as you put it, in one place and moving it to another doesn't mean we shouldn't squeeze the balloon in the first place.
You know, rather than attacking financial infrastructure that's used by thousands of banks and over 100 million consumers, shouldn't our focus be on consumer education to prevent people falling victim to scams?
So I do believe that consumer education has a role to play, but I think that far too often consumer education has been used as an excuse for the banks not to do more. In the complaints that we hear from consumers all the time, and as we heard from Ms. Humphreys just a few minutes ago, scammers are very, very adept at coaching people around any kind of consumer education warnings that they may get from the banks. They are professional, sophisticated criminals. This is what they do all day, every day, and they have an answer to every question and every warning message that you may see in a process. That's why they're professionals. And so while consumer education...
But the FBI is professionals too. Why can't law enforcement crack down on these people more? What's keeping us from getting more of these scammers?
Well, as I said, I don't think that the banks have the incentives they need to invest as much as they should. One of the reasons that we can go after bank robbers is because banks provide the information, closed-circuit video and everything to law enforcement to help them go after that. The banks have skin in the game when there's a bank robbery. We think that banks should have more skin in the game when it comes to bank robbery that just happens to happen on Zelle.
I've been told that 99.9% of transactions processed on Zelle have no reports of fraud or scams. Is that like a reasonable number?
Senator, I have no reason to doubt that number, but in fact, I think that only underscores what we think should happen, that if you create the kind of incentives that would require them to make consumers like Ms. Duvall and Ms. Humphreys whole when this fraud happens, that they should be able to absorb those losses. Either it's a very small problem, or it's a very big problem. If it's a very small problem like they claim, then they shouldn't have any trouble in reimbursing the victims.
Okay, thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Marshall. I want to pick up where I left off, and I apologize if I'm retreading some of the ground that you've covered. Ms. Hand, I was talking to Ms. Duvall and Ms. Humphreys about the cost to them, the emotional cost, but also the disincentives in emotional terms for them to come forward. Could the banks do more to encourage reporting of these kinds of scams?
Sure. The banks could do more to encourage reporting. I think that's one of the things that we saw in the comparison is compared to Venmo, Cash App. We just had a conversation about education. There actually needs to be improved education. That was educational materials. Not to say that education should suffice. It should not. But that was one of the things that we noted in terms of just the quality of the materials that are available to consumers. If you compared Venmo, Cash App to Zelle, it was a very different qualitative experience for consumers. I think the other thing that's different is the actual policies for reimbursement. If you are a bank customer or a Zelle customer, you've got 2 days, which is within the law. But compared to Venmo, for example, where you have 60 days to report an incident of fraud or unauthorized transaction, and the consumers would be made whole.
What does the expanded use of Zelle mean for consumers? Does it put them more at risk? And can they do anything to protect themselves?
It shouldn't be on the consumers. I mean, I think because you are using an app that's effectively integrated into your bank account, it's very different from an app that communicates with your bank account. And so there's some distance there, and I think that actually creates a buffer for consumers and is a safer experience. But frankly, it shouldn't be on a consumer. If you make a car that goes 100 miles an hour, right, it should be on the car manufacturer to ensure that the car is safe, the brakes work, for example. And similarly with respect to Zelle and other products, if you provide a facility for instant payments, there either should be some friction or, frankly, some assumption of liability when consumers are scammed.
As you know, Zelle says, the website at least says, that it should be used only with, quote, friends, family, and people you trust. But increasingly, Zelle is used for commercial transactions with people or entities that literally there's no trust relationship. Landlord, another seller of goods or services, and Zelle and member banks have tips on their websites for how businesses can encourage their clients to use Zelle for commercial or business purposes. If Zelle is going to expand its business model to include greater use of transactions between parties that are unfamiliar to each other, do you think that there ought to be some expansion of Regulation E, as we've discussed it, or some other legal obligation to make sure that there's reimbursement?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we're not just seeing the expansion of the policy, but we're also seeing expansion of use. Increasingly, consumers are offered, so take this out of the fraud and scam context, just for regular day-to-day use. It's not just that consumers are choosing to use Zelle, they're being offered Zelle at the point of sale by merchants or in informal situations. So for example, a contractor doing work on the house will say, well, not just take a check, they'll also take form via a peer-to-peer app, and that's often Zelle as well.
You know, I'm struck with the kind of disparity between the claim that Zelle has no responsibility for these transactions and then the encouragement that it be used for those kinds of transactions outside a relationship of trust. Is that possibly a violation of the Federal Trade Commission laws, Ms. Tater?
Senator, I am not prepared to comment on that, but I think you've made an excellent point that consumers are encouraged to use something that's fast and safe, and it's touted as a safe transaction, and it is routinely proven not to be safe.
You know, I notice in your testimony, Ms. Hand, you have a number of recommendations, which include, in effect, creating more friction, possibly more delay, authentication. Can these kinds of measures cut down on the amount of fraud that is victimizing consumers?
Yeah, absolutely. And they also don't require a change in the law. I mean, these are things that is very much under the control of companies providing the P2P services.
Critical, and I'm quoting, critical friction and multi-layered protections offered by other P2P services like PayPal or Cash App, end quote, are not used by Zelle. Would they be well advised to adopt those kinds of mechanisms?
Yes, they do at the point of entry. So when you are logging into your mobile banking app, yes, you do have to typically authenticate, right? But once you're in that app, you don't have that additional friction, and I think that's a point of distinction with the
Let me
others.
ask you and Mr. Breaux and Ms. Tater whether you've ever gone to Zelle and said, why don't you adopt these kinds of safeguards?
So Senator, we have conversations with Zelle member banks, and I think, they have a role to play, and I think that advocates like me have been and will be talking to them and urging them to take these kinds of steps. But our urging is no substitute for regulation that creates the kind of incentives that would get them to take these steps in the first place. We're already seeing promising signs in the UK where similar reimbursement rules recently went into effect, and I think that that could be a model for what we and you do here in the United States.
Ms. Tater?
I would just make the quick point. I agree, and every lawsuit that I file, I am imploring change and asking banks to do better than what they're doing. The message is maybe received, but I think that strengthening the protections, the consumer protections and regulation-y, and implementing additional protections is the only way to go.
We've heard from victims of these frauds and scams on Zelle that not only did Zelle fail to help them get their money back, but they didn't seem even interested in information that could prevent it from happening again. A woman in Maryland wrote to us about being scammed out of $1,000 on Zelle by someone posing as a police officer. The scammer knew a lot of her personal information, and the phone number displayed on her caller ID was for the local police department. In other words, she looked at the caller ID and it was local police department. After the fraud was discovered, she tried to tell Zelle about this fraud, but here's what their reaction was. Quote, I explained to Zelle I had a police report and I had the name and phone number of an account that is being used for fraud. I asked if they wanted that information so they could shut the Zelle account down. The response was, no, they don't do that. End quote. In other words, not our problem. As I said at the outset, it should be their problem. They care about their customers and consumers. And we're talking here about the banks who have a relationship of trust. Would you say, Ms. Hand, that from a consumer perspective, Zelle is safer than other P2P payment apps?
If you're talking about, I think it depends on what aspect of it. Certainly, based on our report, based on their fraud policies and frankly their educational materials compared to other apps, it ranked lower. Other apps did a better job of providing simple information, also providing more robust reimbursement policies. And again, the friction is a safety mechanism in this instance, and so the absence of that, I would say it's probably less safe.
So, as I said at the outset, these kinds of problems are common to an industry that is not doing enough self-correction and has no real incentives now to do it. And Mr. Breault has emphasized without the reimbursement requirement, and needs to be given additional incentives or requirements explicitly to do it. I'll turn to the ranking member if he has any other questions.
Okay, I'm just looking at the statistics on this, and I don't think we have anywhere near enough information. We really ought to be talking to the banks, because it appears that Zelle requires the banks to do the reimbursement. They don't do it themselves, so they direct the banks to reimburse, correct? Again, fraud, scams, these are a big problem, but they're across all payment platforms. And I'm just looking at the difference, because it's pretty striking. Banks, credit card versus debit card. They reimburse at a much higher percentage for credit card transactions versus debit cards. And then the P2P, peer-to-peer, is much lower. Again, my guess is there's more consumer responsibility the closer you get to peer-to-peer versus a credit card transaction. There's obviously more money made in a credit card transaction than a debit card versus virtually no money being made other than with Venmo and PayPal where they have the compensating balances. But just to throw them out here, debit card for this Bank of America, they reimbursed at a rate of 53% versus for Zelle it was 17%. I didn't do on the credit card, it's probably close to 80 or 90% reimbursement. For JP Morgan Chase, they reimbursed for debit cards about 62.7%, about 11% for Zelle, and they're probably about 80% on credit cards. This is Wells Fargo, very low reimbursement rate on debit cards, 27.4% versus on Zelle it's 24.6%. So that's a real outlier there. So again, I'm just trying to understand the business models. Obviously, consumers like this peer-to-peer. It's growing, and I'm trying to figure out, why, if this is such a huge problem. I mean, according to Zelle, less than 0.1% of transactions are reported as fraud or scams. Again, I can say, any fraud or scam is unacceptable. You can say that, but it's the cost of doing business. It's the cost of using these. And again, we're all concerned in this digital world. What kind of protections do we have? So, listen, I have nothing but sympathy. You should not feel embarrassed about these things. You're up against incredibly sophisticated individuals that know how to prey on people's emotions. It's what should be a regulatory or governmental response to this is, I think, what I'm trying to grapple with. And fraud, scams, unauthorized transactions are going to be a cost of doing business. That is going to be passed on to the consumer. So it's in everybody's best interest to limit this. It's just, what's the best way of putting this thing into, incentivize people who have some ability to track these things and warn consumers and try and prevent these things. And so I'm not disagreeing with any of the testimony. I'm just trying to grapple with the reality of the situation here. Can't say as I really can target Zelle as the bad actor here in any way, shape, or form. They're all grappling with the same problem, and none of them reimbursed at 100% rate. They have different criteria. So this is, from my standpoint, a relatively simple issue, but kind of a complex problem to solve. So, yeah, Ms. Humphreys.
Two things.
And get it as close as possible so I can hear.
Two things. Let's see, now that I'm here, what were they? Why does Wells Fargo want to use Zelle? Well, one thing I read was Wells Fargo likes to use Zelle because it keeps people from using checks, which Wells Fargo then has to process, and therefore, it's cheaper for Wells Fargo for people to use Zelle. So there's a financial benefit for Wells Fargo for people to use Zelle. So if Wells Fargo is reaping some financial benefit for us using Zelle, then why isn't Wells Fargo taking some responsibility for that? So that was.
But they do take. So they do take responsibility.
Not
Again,
the way I
you
see
take
it.
you take it
Anyway.
not 100% responsibility. That's what I'm saying. They take some, and go ahead.
And my other point was, all I think they need to do. I'm a nobody. I'm sitting here with these smart people and you smart people, but it seems to me, when I entered Elenis Jimenez into my Zelle contact list, and I gave the phone number for Elenis Jimenez, then Zelle attached that information to an account that made my transaction successful. And then they couldn't go find out where Elenis Jimenez and her phone number went. I don't believe, again, I don't know how all this works, but when I contacted them within hours and I said, here are all the phone numbers, the lawyer, Elenis Jimenez, all of that. And they said, yeah, it sounds like fraud, but I'm not sure what we're going to do about it. I was incredulous. That can't be. When Google knows that I shopped for shoes on a different device, and now I'm on another device, and everything I look at is telling me about shoes, if they can track my Google searches, why can't Zelle keep a hold of Elena Jimenez and her phone number to get my money back? It's infuriating.
Right,
So
which is a very good question, which is why I think we really need to get the banks in here and follow all these transaction flows. My guess, and it's only a guess, and these are musings by me, not serious questions. But, my guess is that those bank accounts come and go very quickly. They're emptied out very fast and transferred probably into cryptocurrency accounts. It's part of the problem with cryptocurrency now. And they become very untraceable very quickly. But, we're even able to track cryptocurrency things now, too. So again, they're pretty sophisticated investigators on this as well. It does depend on the size of transaction, too, and how much it costs to track down again, no offense, $2,400 or $3,500 fraud versus it's a lot of time and effort potentially in those investigations. Again, I'm not flacking or defending the banks here. I'm just trying to figure out what the reality situation is, what's the best way to grapple with these problems. Yeah, Ms. Hand.
I would say if you could put the reimbursement issue aside for a second, and you're looking at, for example, credit card practices or practices that the bank would use with your debit card. If there's a suspicious charge or payment, right, that payment does not go through my credit card. I get a text, phone call, probably an email immediately when that charge tries to pass, right? And so I think the other perspective here, and we had this conversation with the P2P companies when we were doing the evaluation, is are you taking equivalent steps in this real-time scenario to slow down the transaction, to engage the consumer and say, actually, whatever this person's name is, right? That may have been the 20th time that they tried to scam a consumer. Is that name on a list somewhere that can get flagged for other consumers? So things
Again,
like that.
putting my business and accountant's hat on, okay, and it's a huge difference. Credit card companies reap in hundreds of billions of dollars of the fees, okay? These companies don't do that. They're trying to eke out profits by smaller compensating balance, that kind of stuff. So the credit card companies, one of the services they offer is this fraud protection. Again, they get so much money on the interchange fees that they can, as a cost of doing business, figure, well, yeah, there's going to be X percent fraud, and no questions asked. We just reimburse the customer without having to spend thousands of dollars trying to investigate a particular fraud. I mean, it's just an economic reality. So again, it's to the banks with credit cards, it's just a cost of doing business. Just looking at the reimbursement on debit cards, they probably don't make as much on debit cards. But this is why I'd like to get the banks in here to get their viewpoint on this and what could we potentially do to try and tighten this up. But again, unfortunately, there are criminals out there and they're very sophisticated and they're going to prey no matter what the payment platform is going to be.
Senator Johnson, I have a draft letter which we can send today to those banks, inviting them to come here for hearing in July. I agree with you totally that we ought to have them come in, and I'll give you the draft.
Okay.
So you can have a look at it, but I think your point is very well taken. We need to hear from them. But in the meantime, Mr. Breo, I understand Senator Johnson's point. There's no fee in connection with the use of Zelle that goes to the banks, but there definitely is a business benefit to encouraging and inviting and, in fact, pitching people to use Zelle, as they do.
To the banks.
A benefit to the banks, is there not?
That there is, yes, sir.
And what is that benefit?
Well, there are many benefits that the banks derive from Zelle. The ability to make people stay on their websites and look at other services, loans, for example, that they may take, other fee-bearing services they may be interested in. So certainly the banks are making money off of Zelle, while maybe it's not the same economic model as Venmo or Cash App or credit or debit cards. They are certainly making money off of it.
There may not be an explicit fee that can be identified in an accounting sense attributed to Zelle, but the reason I have Zelle is it gets them more customers, and the customers stay, and they use the bank. And it's like any other cost of doing business for them. They may not see a direct flow of money from that service, but it is ancillary and very important to their business. And as part of the cost of doing business, sometimes they reimburse, but 3/4 of the time they don't when there are losses. So they avoid the costs, the major costs, when there's fraud, but they have the benefits, and it's not just Zelle, it's P2P platforms generally that provide this kind of benefit to the banks, correct?
That's right. These services are not in business to lose money.
Ms. Tater, we talked a little bit about the requirements for reimbursement. I'm interested, because I may not have closed the loop. Have you seen instances in which Zelle customers have not been repaid by their banks, even when indisputably they have an obligation to do so under Regulation E, where the customers actually push the button, so to speak?
Senator, the cases that I bring in court, in federal court, every single time there is clear evidence that the consumer did not authorize the payment. It is why I sue banks for those transactions. That includes sending money to new participants in the Zelle app where the name is a sequence of random numbers and letters, transactions in the amount of $2,000 twice a day, 4 days a week. There are other indicators of fraud, like IP addresses that don't match an IP address that the consumer is normally transacting business from. So yes, I am attempting to hold banks accountable in those very obvious instances of Zelle fraud.
What kinds of explanations do they give for failing to provide what they owe?
I oftentimes hear, and consumers oftentimes hear, that you must have participated. You must have left your PIN number available. You must have left your bank account open on a public computer. You must have somehow authorized somebody to do this to you, or you, in fact, did send the money, even in the face of very clear evidence to the contrary.
I'm going to invite anyone who has anything else to share before we close the hearing. You've been very, very helpful. Every one of you has contributed enormously to our investigation. Obviously, it's an ongoing investigation. Hopefully, the banks will cooperate. Zelle has said it wants to cooperate. Other P2P platforms, I think, or hope, will as well. And I'm going to ask that victim statements be entered into the record, 3 of them, 12 news stories, and 8 university alerts. Universities are now alerting students about the dangers of P2P platforms. That's where we are. That's where we've come to. So thank you all for your testimony, and this record will remain open for 15 days. And the hearing is adjourned.